It is not something that I consider, and I never would, nor would I recommend people guide their training based on their HRV score. And that's not at all to say that HRV is useless. I think that HRV is a very useful metric if, the caveat being if you're measuring it correctly. So, I'm not the expert here. There are people, I would refer people to look up Marco Altini. He's the expert. He's an expert in heart rate variability. Essentially, though, when you're measuring heart rate variability, you want to be in very standardized conditions.
Brady, is zone 2 cardio overrated?
Overrated, yes, but that does not mean it's useless.
Okay. And so what are the best uses of zone 2 cardio? Like, why is it effective?
Yeah, sure. People can think of zone 2 cardio as it's essential for building the aerobic machinery of your body. We hear a lot about what is the best type of exercise if you want to improve your VO2 max or improve your performance. Well, there's no really one best method to do it. Everything plays an important role. High intensity training, zone 2 training does. Zone 2 training, though, is incredibly important for, I would say, two reasons. One, as I mentioned, it builds your aerobic machinery. You can think of it as building your aerobic base. Everything, the foundation of your fitness, essentially, is what zone 2 training is for. Second, it allows people, and mostly, elite athletes, higher level training athletes, to just accumulate a lot of volume without accumulating a lot of fatigue. There reaches a point, obviously, where high intensity training, doing more, will become counterproductive because it accumulates fatigue. You stress your neuromuscular system, your autonomic nervous system. You just simply can't do it. So zone 2 training also allows you to accumulate a lot of volume, build fitness, build that foundation without accumulating unsustainable levels of fatigue.
And so for myself, it says on my heart rate monitor that the top rate of my zone 2 would be 124 beats per minute. Do you agree that if you're well trained or if you're training that you should stay, under, that particular heart rate monitor value that it's given you to stay in zone 2? Or do you feel like sometimes you can push it a little bit into zone 3?
I think that, when you get into talking about heart rate, and especially when it comes to zone 2, things get a little iffy because the technical definition of zone 2 is based on a lactate level, a prescription of lactate. Sometimes you'll see between 1.8 and 2 millimolar, but obviously that will differ between people. Generally below the first lactate threshold is going to be what your zone 2 is. So using heart rate, if you have correlated that heart rate with a lactate level, I think that can be useful. A lot of what you're going to get, say, from a watch, like a wearable, or maybe some sort of algorithm, is just going to be based on heart rate. And if there's not lactate in there, there can be a lot of variation around that. And that is why I think, as you mentioned, so say, if something like your zone 2 is, the upper level is 124, I do think that you have a little bit of wiggle room there where, if you go into the 130s, 135 on a particular day, you could still potentially be in zone 2 from a physiologic level, but not just from a heart rate level, just because there's some of that wiggle room there. So the short answer to that would be yes. I think you could maybe generally push a little bit above that, especially for trained individuals who are maybe a little bit more fit, whose zone 2 tends to be a little bit wider in terms of, what that heart rate level might look like.
So Brady, you're obviously, an elite level runner. You're very well cardiovascular conditioned. So in terms of doing zone 2 for you, do you use a lactate monitor? Do you just kind of go by how you feel? Do you go by heart rate, or how do you actually structure it?
Yeah, so I don't use lactate. I have done a lactate test before, just out of genuine personal interest, but I don't use lactate during training. One, just because it's expensive, and it's also just kind of time consuming unless you have somebody there who's going to be taking your lactate readings. Just doing that by yourself during these training sessions is just kind of not feasible for most athletes. I don't really use heart rate that much either. Heart rate for me, and this differs, from one athlete to the next, but for me, heart rate is more of a thing that I look at after the fact to sort of say, my heart rate was lower during this workout than it was a few weeks ago at the same pace. Maybe I'm getting fitter. I will glance at it during workouts sometimes if I'm really trying to stay below something, or if it's too hot and I really don't want to like burn myself out during a workout. But I don't do a lot of heart rate based training either. So for me, and again, I think this comes with the level of training. I've been running for over half my life. I'm 33 now. Well, will be 33 in a few months, but I started running when I was like 13 to 14. So I have a lot of experience. RPE, I think, can be very valuable for people who are experienced or who at least have are pretty in tune with their body and have been training for a while. And RPE, what I mean by that is rating of perceived exertion, just your effort level. Genuinely, most of the time that I'm training, I'm going based on effort level. And I feel like studies have actually shown that RPE generally correlates pretty well with these different training zones. So that's generally what I use. If I'm going for a zone 2 intensity, that might be a 3, 4, 5 out of 10, say. A zone 3 or a zone 4 might be a 6, 7. And then, a harder is going to be an 8, 9, or a 10. I generally just go by that. And I don't do ratings out loud during my workouts, but I'm just kind of thinking in the back of my mind, this is kind of what my perceived effort is. So for me, effort just generally tends to be a very useful guide. But again, that's going to be different. And if people aren't as experienced, then they might find heart rate to be pretty useful.
What do you think of heart rate variability? Just because, when we're talking about heart rate variability, as many people know now, is becoming more and more popular. People are measuring it. Like I heard Dustin Poirier, one of the, elite guys in the UFC, who's retired now, but he said on, Rogan recently that he just basically threw out his wearable whenever he's in camp because it always tells him that he needs to take a break and he can't take a break, right? And so, when you get a, poor heart rate variability score, like, does that dictate how you train, or is it not something that you even consider at all?
It is not something that I consider, and I never would, nor would I recommend people guide their training based on their HRV score. And that's not at all to say that HRV is useless. I think that HRV is a very useful metric if, the caveat being, if you're measuring it correctly. So, I'm not the expert here. There are people, I would refer people to look up Marco Altini. He's the expert. He's an expert in heart rate variability. Essentially, though, when you're measuring heart rate variability, you want to be in very standardized conditions. So you want to wake up in the morning. You want to use a heart rate strap, ideally, not something that's on your wrist. And you want to control your breathing rate. You're going to control kind of your posture. All of these things have to be well controlled. So if you're using like an app that is specifically designed to measure HRV and you have a strap and you do it at the same time in the same conditions every morning, then it can be very valuable. But the number that you're getting from your watch, from your Oura Ring, from your bed, from your Whoop strap, whatever you're using, I really don't think there's a lot of value in those just because they're measuring HRV overnight. You're not controlling for a lot of those variables that do influence HRV. So I'm not saying the number is random. I think that there could be some interesting info if you look at the heart rate variability trend, say from week to week. I do think that there's probably some patterns there that could be informative. But in general, if you wake up and your HRV is super low, I wouldn't say that you should scrap, say, a hard training session. Because of that, I think that first you should go to, how did I feel when I woke up this morning? I think the wearables are valuable. I love all the data that I get from mine. But I think one of the things that we fall into is looking at the wearable data first before we assess how we feel subjectively. So, I open my Oura Ring app every morning and see, how did I sleep? What's my HRV? What was my resting heart rate? But before I do any of that, I'm just like, how do I feel this morning? And then I use the data to maybe either confirm, validate how I feel versus the other way around, because there can actually be this nocebo effect with the data from these wearables where if you wake up and
the nocebo for people who aren't familiar with that term.
Yes. So the placebo effect, many people will know where, if somebody gives you a supplement or maybe just any sort of intervention where you're expecting a benefit, that you may get a benefit from that, even if, there's not actually a physiological benefit. So if I gave you a placebo pill and said, hey, this is caffeine, it'll make you feel alert and improve your performance. And then you go do something and it improves your performance, but there was no caffeine in it. That's the placebo effect. It's basically influenced by your thoughts about what the intervention might be doing. And it's a real physiological effect. I'm not saying, often people dismiss the placebo effect saying, oh, it's just the placebo. Well, it's not just, it actually impacts your physiology. But the nocebo effect is the opposite. So somebody telling you something is going to be harmful, or you see something that you interpret as potentially being bad for you, and then it actually has a physiological effect on your body. So
they've done that for gluten. I'm
yeah, gluten. Yep. You tell somebody there's gluten in something, if they claim to be, say, gluten intolerant or something like that, and they eat it and they have all these reactions, but there's actually no gluten in it. Yeah. Yeah. So for HRV, the example there is if you wake up in the morning, I open my app, my HRV is like 40. Oh, it's usually 80. And then I just start to feel, oh man, my workout today is going to suck. I'm just going to feel like crap because I'm not recovered. If I wouldn't have seen that score, I maybe would have had a fine workout. So that would be an example of the nocebo effect there. And it's one reason why, again, I think about how you feel before you let these wearables and things like that inform you. Because I've had several days where I wake up, and more often than not, if my HRV is low, my recovery score says it's low, I'll have one of the best workouts of the day. And then if maybe on another day where it's high, I may not perform as well. So just, I wouldn't let them guide your training. I just don't feel like we're at the level of sophistication yet with these where they can kind of guide training in the right way.
Yeah, I agree. And I've had, the same things happen with me as well. Sometimes when, I don't even have my greatest sleep, I actually have, a great workout. And actually an example is that today was my worst sleep I had in about a week, but yet I did my Norwegian 4x4 this morning, got up to 9.0 miles an hour for the first time. So it doesn't mean that just because you didn't have a perfect night's sleep that you're going to have a poor workout, or, so I do think that we should take, that into context. Just coming back to zone 2 for a bit, like I've heard people like Dr. Andy Galpin and others say that, you should do about 70% of your cardio within zone 2. Like as an elite runner, cardiovascular conditioned person, do you agree with that? Or how much time do you spend per week in zone 2, and how much percentage overall?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think it definitely depends on your level of training though. So the 80-20 kind of breakdown of training is kind of interesting in terms of its origins. And so when you look at what the origins of it are, it's essentially studying the training distribution of elite athletes after the fact. And if you look at kind of these large populations of Tour de France cyclists, mainly cyclists kind of in some of these studies, if you look at their training, it generally tended to break down into, that 80% is this low intensity, 20% is kind of this high intensity training. And what I always find interesting about that is that it wasn't ever really a prescription. It's kind of just the pattern that these athletes fell into. They're doing such high volumes of training that essentially it's 20% is sort of the cap on the amount of high intensity training that they can do when you're doing 20 to 30 hours a week of endurance work. So that kind of then trickled down into, you should prescribe 80% of your training as moderate or low to moderate and 20% at high. I think that there's a lot of value in that. And I do think that that's a great way to prescribe training. That would be typically generally considered what is known as polarized training, where you're really just doing either a lot of low intensity and then a little bit of very high intensity, not a lot of stuff in that middle area. When you're more trained, and most of the studies, meta-analyses would suggest that if you're in highly trained athletes, either the polarized model generally performs a little bit better, or that it really, doesn't matter. The other approach is called pyramidal training, where you have a lot of kind of low intensity at the base. You're doing a medium amount of moderate intensity stuff, and then a little bit of high intensity stuff. So in the pyramidal training, there's a little bit more moderate intensity. That tends to work better for people who are maybe less trained because they're not doing as much volume. So they can do some more of that kind of moderate intensity training. But for athletes, for people who are actually training, I think that 80-20 works very well. And if I look at my own training distribution, it generally does fall within that pattern, despite me not prescribing any of it. I don't set out during the week and say, okay, 4 out of my 7 sessions need to be low intensity, and then, 2 or 3 of during the week need to be high intensity. But if I go into my heart rate zones at the end of a week, it always pretty much lines up with that pattern. It's like 75 to 80% low, 20% high, maybe even less high, like 10 to 15%, depending on where I'm at in my training.
Wow, that's really, really interesting how you just kind of naturally fall into that. And thanks for explaining the history for that too, because that's not something that I ever heard anyone else talk about. And in terms of, the zone 2 training sessions, I've seen that you need to be in zone 2 for about at least 30 minutes to get any kind of beneficial mitochondrial biogenesis. Then you get a little bit more at 40 minutes, 60 minutes, 75 minutes. Seems to, from my understanding, cap relatively around 75 to 90 minutes. But in terms of, zone 2 sessions, how many minutes do you like to prescribe, like for yourself or for others per week?
Yeah, I mean, you hate to sort of set a minimum, because obviously if somebody's going out for 10 minutes and they're just doing a zone 2, I think that could be beneficial. But I really do think that probably 30 minutes minimum, 30 to 45 minutes for a zone 2 session. And then, going up anywhere to 90 to 2 hours. I think everybody should probably aim for at least, and maybe it doesn't have to be zone 2, but everybody should aim for like a 90-minute to a 2-hour endurance session every week. That doesn't mean you have to go running or riding a bike, but go for a hike, something like that. Or, I don't know, you could even play a soccer match for 2 hours for all I care. You're probably in zone 2 for most of that time, but just get one session during the week where you're very long, intense, your kind of ultra endurance session, maybe we'll call it. But yeah, I think that 30 minutes to 45 minutes per session would be kind of a good minimum. But I also think that if you are unable to, unfortunately, set aside 30 to 45 minutes during a day, that you should probably still accumulate 30 to 45 minutes, but you could do that in 3 10-minute bouts or 3 15-minute bouts if that's necessary. I once kind of was tied to the idea that you had to just do one exercise session during the day. It needed to be 30 to 60 minutes to be beneficial. And if it was less than that, you wouldn't get a benefit. But now I think that even if you break it up during the day and do 3 10-minute sessions, 3 15-minute sessions, that can be just equally as beneficial for health benefits, potentially not the performance benefits. But if you're just exercising for cardiovascular health, I think that accumulating exercise in bouts of 10 minutes or less can still be beneficial. And there's good evidence to support that.
And these long zone 2 sessions, will those actually enhance like your high intensity cardiovascular sessions?
They will. And obviously it's indirectly, because as I referred to earlier, you're building that foundation. So what zone 2 is really doing is helping you build a more dense capillary network. It is improving your stroke volume, so the amount of blood that your heart can pump each beat. And those things are going to then, yes, allow you to do your high intensity training sessions at a higher quality. So they may not, for people who are less fit, I do think that zone 2 and lower intensities will actually increase your VO2 max. For other people who are maybe more well-trained, that zone 2 is the foundation that's probably going to allow you to exercise harder, which is then going to allow you to improve your VO2 max more. So it's kind of this more indirect benefit, I think, is the way I would think about it.
So you just mentioned capillary density and stroke volume. So from my understanding and research, and please, correct me here if I'm wrong, like the ways that we improve cardio, like scientifically, would be in mitochondrial biogenesis, or, generating more mitochondria so we can get more ATP, increasing your lactate threshold, increasing your stroke volume, and then your capillary density. So I know it's kind of a big question, but could you just go through those 4 and explain how those improve your cardio overall?
Yeah, for sure. I think when we think about cardio, and maybe I'll refer to cardio in this case as your general aerobic fitness, your VO2 peak, your VO2 max. It's generally divided into 2 main, quote, limiters of VO2 max. So either 2 ways you can improve it, or two kind of bottlenecks that are maybe limiting people's aerobic fitness. One is central adaptations or central limitations, and the other would be peripheral. Central meaning your cardiovascular system. And as you mentioned, that refers to your stroke volume. So generally, stroke volume is considered to be the main limiters to VO2 max. So it's a central limitation. So basically, why can't your VO2 max get higher, or what's limiting your VO2 max? It's your body's ability to just pump more blood. It just reaches the point where, you can't pump more blood. Your body has a higher capacity to use oxygen than your body has the capacity to get oxygen. So at maximal exercise, it's just, you can't pump enough blood to get to the working muscle, and that's what's limiting your VO2 max. Stroke volume, for people who may not be familiar with the term, that just refers to the amount of blood that's coming out of your left ventricle of your heart per beat. So when it squeezes, ejects blood, your stroke volume in liters per minute. That is what stroke volume is. And for many people, especially highly trained athletes, stroke volume is the main limiter. You just simply can't increase the size of your heart enough to get as much blood to the working muscles that would be required at a certain level of exercise. Then you have the peripheral factors, as you mentioned, mitochondria, so their ability to extract oxygen from the blood to produce ATP, and then the capillary networks, and that's kind of part of the transport process. So you have to have blood vessel function and capillaries, which are the thin-walled blood vessels that are basically situated right next to your muscles, where the oxygen diffuses out of the blood into the muscles, eventually into the mitochondria. Capillaries are those thin-walled vessels, those fine blood vessels, and that's where oxygen diffusion occurs. And so when you exercise, you're building up that capillary network. The more capillaries you have, the more surface area that you have to diffuse oxygen, the more oxygen you can get into the muscle, the more the mitochondria can produce it. So then the peripheral limitations are, if you don't have as dense of a capillary network, or your mitochondrial density is not as high, you're not going to have the ability to extract the oxygen that you're actually delivering it. So that can be another site of the quote unquote VO2 max limitation. And it's kind of interesting. So I mentioned earlier that, and pardon me if I'm going too deep here, but this stuff is really interesting to me.
Please do, because I've never heard anyone explain it this well, and I'm very interested in these mechanisms. So
So as I mentioned, it was once thought, and I guess it still is, and it's generally true, that central limitation is mostly where most people are limited. So the stroke volume is kind of what's limiting VO2 max. But there have been a few studies in the past couple of years. I've written about several of these on my Substack, actually, but showing that the limitation of VO2 max actually changes in certain situations. So if you're trained, if you're regularly engaging in aerobic exercise, you're a high level athlete, then the limitation to VO2 max is central. It's, your machinery, your ability to produce ATP using oxygen, so mitochondria capillaries, are overbuilt. So what's limiting your max is your heart's ability to actually get oxygen to the working muscles. That's when you're trained. If you're untrained, it's actually the opposite. So you don't have the machinery that can take up that oxygen, deliver it, and take it up to produce ATP. So your heart is delivering more than enough, more oxygen or more blood and more oxygen than your body is actually able to use. So untrained people have a peripheral limitation to VO2 max. Trained people generally tend to have a central limitation to VO2 max. And then if you go from fit to unfit, that limitation changes. So basically training will make the central limitation instead of the peripheral. So it actually kind of changes. So the heart is not the main limiter for everyone. And I think that same thing is basically happening too with say aging. So why does VO2 max decline with age? Likely due to a loss of muscle mass. You're losing muscle mass, you're losing capillary networks, so your body just simply can't take up all of that oxygen and use it to produce energy.
Very, very interesting. Thanks so much for explaining that. I've never heard anyone, explain it in that detail before. Just coming back to training for a second. So we talked a little bit about zone 2. I mentioned Norwegian 4x4s. So for people who are not familiar with that term, basically you're going 4 minutes hard, 3 minutes easy. You do that for 4 rounds. And so why is the Norwegian 4x4 protocol so effective for improving VO2 max?
Yeah, I would say a couple of reasons. I think one of the main reasons why it at least appears to be most effective and so popular is because it's definitely the most well-studied protocol. So I know on social media, there's a lot of coaches that will rail against the health influencers for just promoting the Norwegian 4x4 as the best protocol for improving it. I mean, it may not be the best, but it is the most well studied. That's for sure. I mean, there are dozens, if not hundreds of research studies that use the Norwegian 4x4 and show it to be effective. So I just think that it's a protocol that's been studied. So it's an easy one to say, hey, it's effective because it's actually shown to be, versus an interval prescription that we might just like pull out of thin air that hasn't been subjected to this rigorous study in all these different populations. But the reason why it's so effective, but the reason why it is so effective is because it's kind of that optimal duration for where you want to improve your VO2 max, which is between 2 and 5 minutes, or 2 and probably 8 minutes for the length of the interval. That seems to be the optimal duration if your main goal is improving VO2 max. And why that is because, many people might think, if I want to improve my VO2 max, doing the hardest, fastest interval possible is probably the best way to do it, right? And that would be something like sprint interval training. So maybe I want to go as hard as I can for 30 seconds to a minute. The problem with that is that there's a lag time between when you start exercising that hard and when your heart rate is able to get to, say, 85 to 90%. So if you went out, right now, Mike, and started running on your treadmill, you said you got to 9 miles per hour today for your 4x4. Let's say you bump that up to 11. So you're basically sprinting on your treadmill for 30 seconds because you want to increase your VO2 max. Well, your legs are going to give out before your heart rate gets a chance to get up to 90% of your maximal heart rate. You just haven't given it enough time to do that. So if you're doing sprints, you're doing 30-second sprint, 30-second rest, 30-second sprint, 30-second rest. You're going to be exhausted at the end of that, and you're getting a good workout in, but your heart rate is never spending a lot of time at that 85 to 90% because there's a lag. So it takes time. It takes probably 30 seconds to a minute for your heart rate to get to 85%. By the time you get there, that interval's over. But when you do something like the Norwegian 4x4, you're spending a lot of time. You might spend the first 30 seconds getting your heart rate up to 85% of max, but then you're staying there for 3 to 4 minutes and then letting it come back down. So you're getting a lot of time at that elevated heart rate and a lot of time at that elevated oxygen consumption versus something like sprint interval training. So the duration there is mainly why it's so effective.
Yeah, I actually just checked my phone while you were explaining all that, and I saw there today. So I spent 11 minutes and 17 seconds in zone 5 today, and so I did a little bit of research on this as well, and like it seems to be like the golden kind of minutes, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is somewhere between about 8 to 15 minutes, like twice a week. As long as you can spend that much time in around zone 5 or higher, that's a good amount where you're going to be able to get a lot of work done. But then once you go past like 30 minutes a week, you're kind of then potentially risking injury or like overdoing it. So would you say it's, the Norwegian 4x4 protocol works because you kind of get into that like Goldilocks zone of like zone 5 cardio, and if you do that say 1 to 2 times a week, you're kind of getting into the Goldilocks zone of like how many minutes of zone 5 you should be in per week?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And the protocol is generally short enough that in theory I would say you could do it twice a week if you wanted to. I think for most people just doing it once a week is probably sufficient. Funnily enough, there's plenty of studies where they have people doing it like 3 times a week for 8 to 12 weeks, which is just kind of insane. I mean, they're generally unfit people maybe doing this, which maybe actually makes it even more impressive. But I think that kind of counters the idea that, you'll see a lot of people say, oh, high intensity training is unsustainable and you can't just do it, so many times per week. And I like to refer to the fact that there are dozens of studies, several weeks long, several months long, where they're doing it 3 times a week. I've even, not participated in, but when I was in graduate school, we used the Norwegian 4x4. People who are older, people with diabetes, we'd have them do it 2 to 3 times per week, and they could tolerate it. And it's because it's all that they're doing. So they're not also, doing 3 Norwegians per week and 2 hour zone 2 training. I mean, they're just doing 3 Norwegian 4x4s a week. And I say just, but it's not that time intensive. It's 40 minutes. If you do a 10-minute warm up, 10-minute cool down, do the protocol, it's 40 minutes total. So you're doing an hour, less than an hour per day. But yeah, I think it hits that sweet spot that you're talking about and you can do it once a week. It's effective, maybe twice a week, even more effective. Again, just depending on your goal. If it's health, great. If it's performance, you might not want to be doing it twice a week.
Yeah, I do it once a week, and then I have one intense mixed martial arts workout per week as well. And then I also doing some leg training. So, between those three things, my legs are pretty much like at their max. I find doing any more than that kind of, taxes me a little bit. And then, going back to what you were saying, about people doing it, 3 times a week or possibly more. Like there was a time where I was doing MMA like 3 times a week. But again, the exact same thing. I was just doing some weight training on the other days. I wasn't doing any other cardio at all. So that's probably why I could, tolerate it. So in terms of like dynamic movements, do you feel like that's important as well for improving cardio? So what I mean by that is like doing things like a sport, like, mixed martial arts or soccer or hockey or something like that, where you're not exactly like, you don't know how long you're going to be on the ice for. You don't know how long an exchange is going to be in MMA. Like, do you think those things are also important for improving cardio overall? Or do you think that it's not necessarily like necessary to mix in as long as you're getting, a good bit of zone 2 training and also a good bit of, Norwegian 4x4s or zone 4 and zone 5 training?
I think that those modalities can be good, not necessarily maybe uniquely for cardio though, but maybe for other reasons. I think if you're just trying to improve your cardio, your VO2 max, then doing maybe these more structured, you're on the treadmill, you're on the elliptical, you're on the stationary cycle, you're on the rower. I think those may actually be better because they're more rhythmic. You can control the power output, you can control the pace better. I think that if you're really just trying to target something like VO2 max, doing those more, machine-based kind of modalities can actually be better. But I do think that like things like you mentioned, so playing soccer, doing MMA, where you're getting the dynamic movements, you're getting the lateral movements. I think that those things could be good for different reasons. I mean, you're going to be improving your cardiovascular fitness while doing them because your oxygen consumption's up, your heart rate's up. But I also think that they're probably great for cognitive health because, you have to navigate space. Not to mention they're fun for most people. I mean, they're activities, so you're actually doing something. But also just probably neuromuscular benefits as well of the side to side movement. Being a runner, I don't get a lot of lateral movement. I'm kind of just all in this like frontal plane. So things like that can be beneficial for runners or people who just tend to move in one direction all the time. So yeah, several benefits there. And I think you're getting those benefits along with the cardiovascular benefits. So yeah, I think that if you enjoy them, if you want to improve your cardiovascular fitness and kind of get at a sport at the same time, I think that those modalities could be good as well. But I don't think they're probably maybe optimal if you're just trying to improve your cardiovascular fitness.
So let's talk about leg training for a bit and how that can, weave into our overall fitness. So, assuming you have a leg day in your workout routine, like how many days should you separate this from doing, say, your sprints or your sports or your Norwegian 4x4?
So the approach that I actually tend to take, and I think that can be useful for a lot of people, is do it on the same day as your sprint or your interval training, but do it afterwards. So you're not going to do leg day after you do high intensity sprints. Now, the caveat there, the trade-off could be that if you do your sprints in the morning and then try to do a leg day in the afternoon or afterwards, you might be a little too fatigued to actually go to your max during the leg day. But for a lot of people, and for runners especially, I think I like to actually prescribe strength training, and for myself too, the strength session on the day that I do my intervals. But again, I'm doing it on the day afterwards because that sort of eliminates the technicalities of, when am I going to do, how many days am I going to do in between my leg day and my interval session? You're doing it on the same day. And so I know I'm going to have a couple recovery days afterwards before either my next interval workout or maybe my next leg day workout. So that could be a useful strategy. I would say if you aren't going to do them on the same day because you really want to, say, prioritize that leg day and, get your maximum output during that, I would say have at least 2 days between a leg day and, say, a higher intensity interval day. So you do leg day on Monday, wait until Wednesday to do your intervals, maybe Thursday. I think that could be an ideal situation as well. I wouldn't do, the day after probably some intervals because there's going to be some of that fatigue there. And probably just pay attention to some muscle soreness as well. I would say if you're having delayed onset muscle soreness, which is pretty indicative of, you have some muscle damage going on, maybe wait another day. So maybe give it 3 days in between that if you have a little more muscle soreness than usual. But that should probably be adequate.
Are there any leg exercises that are particularly beneficial for improving cardio?
Man, that's tough. I don't really have a good answer to that. But I mean, if you're going to increase the muscle mass of your legs, I mean, you're going to increase the amount of muscle that you have in your body. So your oxygen uptake could potentially increase. So, I don't not squats, deadlifts, anything like that. But I don't have too much evidence there or anything that I can say is particularly good for improving your cardiovascular fitness. I mean, there are certain leg exercises.
You do deadlifts and squats, or you don't?
I do them occasionally, not as much as I probably should. I'll try to deadlift, if I'm in a made training block, I'll try to deadlift maybe once a week. I try to get like one really heavy kind of lower body lift, but a lot of the times I'm doing more, I don't know if you'd call them accessory exercises, but like Bulgarian split squats. That's one of my favorites. Those suck, too. But I find them to be very effective because you're getting that hinge, you're getting kind of that dynamic range of motion. I like to do this with dumbbells.
Same here.
But yeah, in terms of improving your cardiovascular fitness, I don't think that there's a particular leg exercise that would be better. Really, those are just going to be supportive in terms of allowing you to train harder.
Yeah, I had a back injury a few years ago. And so since that, I don't do any deadlifts and I don't do any like heavy squats at all. So I basically do Bulgarian split squats, like you mentioned. And I think it is good to do like at least one, unilateral leg exercise. I think if that's missing from your leg day, you should probably consider adding that in. And then I do hip thrusts with a lateral band. And the reason I do that is I find that it just hits my glute med like nothing else. And, for people who, aren't familiar with the glute medius, it's critically important for, your overall gait. Like they call it the anti-waddle muscle. I find it to be really, helpful for even my posture overall. The Nordic curls is another thing that I do as well. I just, love doing those. I try to go down in the eccentric, like, pretty slow overall, because I think that's where you get a lot of the benefit from, and really good for not just like improving strength, but almost like a rehab or a prehab exercise as well, for preventing injury. And then
I love the Nordic curls. Those will expose you because they will really expose where if you have some hamstring weakness, because if I restart them after not doing them for a while, you're just like, oh my gosh, I can't even hold myself up for, even a little bit during that eccentric phase. I'm curious, so you said you kind of focus on the eccentric, which I tend to do as well, but what do you do for the concentric? Do you try to pull yourself back up? Do you push off of the ground? Like, how do you go about doing those?
I just pull myself back up. Yeah. So I find that like the concentric part is actually pretty easy. Like I can always do it. So like I can do it when it's, completely flat at 0 degrees. But when I do it flat at 0 degrees, my eccentric part looks pretty ugly. And so, right now I sometimes I still go to, 5 degrees or 10 degrees, but I think that really at 15 degrees is where I'm doing the eccentric part, like really properly. So I have, as you probably do too, like those guys that, made that freak athlete. That's the thing that I have no affiliation with them or anything, but some of those guys just like go down so slow and then they just pop up, and man, like that is so much harder to do than it looks. I was certainly humbled by that. The first time I was trying, I was like, holy shit, this is really, really tricky here. So
yeah,
I've seen legs.
I've seen some videos of like these NFL players, man, and they're just like, they're doing it almost like a leg curl. They're just like going back up and forth. And I mean, it's the strength there is just ridiculous. Like it really does show you how much of a freak athlete they are. Those guys are, especially when you try to do it yourself. Yeah. And yeah, I think I may have the same thing that you're talking about. I actually have something called the Nord Stick. So it's like a portable. Yeah, it's a portable one. It basically just goes under your door, and you could like travel with it. You can take it anywhere. It's not ideal because it's not as structurally sound as something you might do in a gym, but I found it to be pretty beneficial. And I appreciate you reminding me of that too. I haven't done them in like months, so I'm I'm going to get back to doing some, maybe do some today after our podcast.
Yeah, I think they do have a different name in the States for whatever reason, like the Hyper Nordic or something like that. But anyways, it's a really cool machine anyway. And again, like no affiliation with them at all. Just coming back to like running, what's the most common running technique mistake that most people make that just reduces their overall efficiency and economy of running?
Oh man, yeah, that one might be difficult because I think it's going to be different between, runner to runner. I mean, biomechanics, everybody kind of has their own quirks that maybe reduce their efficiency. I mean, I'll kind of maybe something say a little more esoteric, but we could think about like maybe breathing. I mean, it's something that a lot of people will sort of just dismiss, but I think a lot of people, and we've been talking about zone 2 training a lot, but one of the hallmarks of, say, you're in zone 2 is that you could probably do nose breathing through the entire time. So if you're kind of gasping for air, you can't really breathe through your nose in the entire time. That's a pretty good indicator that you're probably not in zone 2 as well. But you're definitely more efficient, at least at zone 2. I would say maybe not at higher intensities if you're just breathing through your nose and out through your mouth. And so I would say focusing, a lot of people just focusing on your breathing could potentially help you be more efficient, just because you're not placing as much stress on your respiratory muscles. And if you think about it, your respiratory muscles are a muscle. So if you're exercising, you're breathing inefficiently, you're using more oxygen to take in air, inhale and exhale, and that's reducing the oxygen that's available to the rest of your body to exercise and produce energy. So I would say that could be maybe an efficiency mistake that's not tied to biomechanics, because again, it's just going to be impossible probably to say that there's one big mistake people are making biomechanically, but breathing is generally something that most people can probably improve upon.
I was actually going to ask you about breathing. And so, how did you improve upon your own breathing? Like, did you find that you were making any mistakes and that you had to do something to correct it? Did you follow any kind of like program? And is that something that you often prescribe to other people who want to improve their breathing and want to improve their cardio?
No program, but I would just say being conscious of it. So if you're doing a very controlled zone 2 workout, generally when I'm on the bike is when I'll kind of try to focus on it. But if I'm in zone 2, if I'm doing like a zone 2 session, I'll really be conscious about closing my mouth and breathing in through my nose. One of the things that I've kind of played around lately is using these little nose strips to put on my nose, which actually open up your nostrils a little bit more. And there's a lot of debate over whether those actually work. I mean, you feel a noticeable difference when you put it on. Your nostrils are open more, the airflow is better. And so if you really want to kind of bring awareness to that area and do the nose breathing, I think that can be pretty effective. But I didn't follow any specific protocol. You'll see a lot of these, and maybe this is kind of separate from breathing, but when we're thinking about protocols for improving VO2 max, those altitude training masks that are supposed to sort of help you improve your VO2 max, they're not really doing anything. They're just restricting your ability to breathe. And so they might be doing more harm than they will be doing good. But one thing that I haven't tried that I think is effective is inspiratory muscle strength training. There's actually a lot of good evidence out there, and not just in people with, say, lung conditions, but generally fit, healthy, trained individuals, that using these inspiratory muscle training devices can actually help improve your performance and help improve your breathing. So essentially what they are is, if you think about, people have ever gone snorkeling or scuba diving, you'll sort of have a mouthpiece with it. And then it's just this device that will provide resistance when you're inhaling. So you kind of, you put it in your mouth and you breathe in, you can set the resistance, but it'll make it harder to breathe in. So it's like strength training for your lungs and your diaphragm, essentially. And using that does actually seem to not only kind of improve your muscle strength of your inspiratory muscles, but it actually lowers blood pressure and has all of these other cardiovascular effects that are pretty remarkable. I actually have a friend, Joseph Watso, who is at Florida State University. He's doing some research on inspiratory muscle devices for cardiovascular benefits. And they're finding some pretty remarkable benefits for that. So I would recommend, if people are interested in one protocol, say, to try to improve your breathing and by proxy probably improve your endurance performance, your cardio, look into maybe some of these devices. I think they're relatively inexpensive.
That's awesome, because I was actually just going to ask you about that. That was going to be my next question. Like, I think some people call them breathing spacers, or some people call them, just basically, as you said, like strength training for your, cardiovascular muscles, and people are getting some kind of, benefit. And not to harp on it like too much, but, how much benefit are people, getting? Like, is it like, a 5% increase in their VO2? Like, what, do you see overall in the studies? What do they say?
Yeah, there aren't I think too many studies on say VO2 max, and to be honest, I can't really cite a number off the top of my head for like what the performance improvement might be, because there are really only like relatively few studies on there. But in terms of like the blood pressure lowering effects, they're actually pretty significant. So like a 5 to 10 millimeter mercury reduction. I know we're not talking about blood pressure in this, but it's like, comparable to exercise intervention, comparable to, like blood pressure lowering medication. So they're pretty effective. But in terms of what it's going to do to improve VO2 max, it's hard to say. And it also, you independent of training, it could probably help, but obviously you want to kind of layer that on top of, use that as an adjunct to training, not just a quote unquote hack to improve your VO2 max. If you don't change anything and start using these devices, I think that can have a benefit, but obviously if you're also training, it's going to be good as well. And the crazy thing is, you use it for, I think, 5 minutes a day, maybe, and that's it. You just got to do 5 minutes a day of it, and it can help. So, I have no affiliation again to these devices, but I think Power Breathe is one of the devices that's used pretty commonly. So if people want to look that up, again, no affiliation with them, but just one brand that I'm familiar with.
Cool. No, that's awesome. It's always good to learn good evidence-based techniques for, outside of training. And one more question I have for you about, a technique that comes up, all the time, this not just for VO2 max, but saunas. So some people now are saying that, if you get in the sauna after you do a cardiovascular workout, you may get a small benefit. I mean, not so small. I've seen people quote like 2 to 5%, which is 5% is a lot, especially if you're, an elite, athlete like yourself. That can be potentially the difference between, winning a race and not winning a race. Is sauna something that you've incorporated into your routine?
Yeah, the sauna is huge. I use it in my own routine, not only because I like it, but also just due to this, I would say, accumulating evidence. There's still kind of a small evidence base on sauna, but it used to be thought that, you would use the sauna just for heat training. So if you want to, if you're an endurance athlete and you have an Ironman coming up, you have a marathon coming up and it's going to be hot, you need to use the sauna to help you with this passive heat acclimation. But now there's pretty decent evidence that using the sauna, and hot bath actually too, hot baths and sauna appear to have pretty equal effects on some of these performance outcomes and these VO2 max outcomes and the cardiovascular health outcomes. But using them will improve your performance in your VO2 max in just temperate conditions, so not even in hot conditions. And that is, when used probably alone, but yes, as you mentioned, in conjunction with training. So post-exercise hot water immersion, post-exercise sauna use. So say getting in 20 to 30 minutes into a sauna after your aerobic training sessions during a week does tend to seem to improve VO2 max around 5 to 10 mLs per kg per minute. In some of these studies, I think the most recent study that I was looking at, I think it was around a 5 ml per kg per minute increase on top of training versus say just training alone. Your baseline training status will certainly determine kind of the extent of the benefit that you receive there, but a lot of good evidence there. And I think what's great about this,
because of the stroke volume, Brady,
it's due to a lot of different adaptations. So I mean, the studies using the hot baths and the sauna have pretty much shown that a lot of these adaptations you're getting from each of them is very similar to altitude training. So, runners, endurance athletes have used altitude training for a long time because when you go to altitude, it stimulates EPO production because the pressure of oxygen is lower. So your body increases the production of red blood cells so that you can, basically can equalize your, oxygen distribution to the rest of your body. So altitude increases EPO production, increases red blood cells, increases plasma volume. So the amount of overall blood volume you have, as well as your hematocrit. So the percentage of your blood volume that's red blood cells, and your hemoglobin. So your oxygen carrying proteins in the blood. Many of these adaptations happen when you get into the sauna or when you do the hot bath training. So it's literally simulating altitude training, which is pretty crazy. So yes, it will. I would say stroke volume potentially, because your plasma volume is higher, it could increase stroke volume, but it's not physically. It may not actually be strengthening your heart like aerobic exercise would, because it's more passive heat acclimation. But it's like zone 1 cardio. I mean, if you do the sauna for long enough, for like, 20, 30, 40 minutes, it's like zone 1 cardio session. Obviously, you're not activating muscles while you're in there, so it's passive, but it's having a lot of these same adaptations. So I'm a huge proponent of post-exercise heat immersion, hot water immersion or sauna lately. There's just some really cool studies coming out. I think it's super useful. And that's whether you're training for performance or just general health. I think pairing sauna, hot bath with exercise, if you're trying to lower your blood pressure, if you're trying to improve your endothelial function, all of those things seem to be better if you combine exercise versus just doing them alone. So yeah, a lot of fun evidence there. And heat's just enjoyable, I think, in my opinion.
I agree.
Maybe you found something similar, but like
No,
the sauna is just fun and great.
I was doing it at one point, like 6 to 7 days a week. Like I remember, like I've had full months where like I didn't miss a day. I've kind of backed it off to about 4 times a week recently, just because, time and that kind of thing. Slightly personal question though. Do you or do you not use an ice pack on your nuts when you're in the sauna?
I do not. And I never have, even when my wife and I were, attempting to achieve a pregnancy, which we've successfully done now twice. So I don't know, N equals 1 there, but I do not put an ice pack down there when I do it. Maybe I should, but I'm just not that convinced. I think there's pretty strong evidence that getting in a hot bath or a hot tub or a jacuzzi, pretty terrible for your fertility. I'm not that convinced sauna is as bad, because you're not directly kind of, I wouldn't say immersing, but your testicles aren't actually in like hot water. So their regulating mechanisms can kind of work. They can, I don't know how everything works, but they can cool themselves, but not so much when you're in a jacuzzi. So, I would say, I'm not the expert again here, but I think if you're, concerned about fertility, trying to maybe get pregnant, probably avoid the jacuzzi for the sauna. I mean, yeah, if you want to use ice bath, or ice pack, if you're convinced about that, I think you should do it. But I think a lot of it right now is just kind of influencers hopping on the hype of saying something inflammatory. I don't know if there's super good evidence to support that, but I don't think there's any harm in doing it.
Well, I'm glad that you were able to achieve 2 pregnancies, just by doing it without the ice pack. So congrats on that.
Yeah, I keep telling my wife, I say I did everything wrong and we still were able to to do it twice. And like I ride a bike for several hours a week. I use the sauna a ton, and I don't know. Sometimes it's just luck of the draw, I guess,
Well, I guess as George Costanza says, your boys can swim. So that's all that really matters.
Indeed.
In terms of like red light therapy, is that something that can be beneficial as well? And like, I ask about that, not just for recovery, but, mechanistically, it would make sense that could potentially, improve your cardio just through generating more mitochondria, because that's supposed to, supposedly that's what it does, the red light and the near infrared light, what we call photobiomodulation. It's supposed to help with, ATP. Do you think there's any evidence that red light therapy can help with overall with improving cardio, or do you think it's more just like it helps overall with recovery and delayed onset muscle soreness and that kind of thing?
I would say the latter, probably. So those indirect benefits. I mean, if you're going to, and I'm not really aware of any strong evidence to either of those, whether it improves recovery or improves mitochondria, at least in humans. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of evidence in mice for red light. But yeah, I think, the muscle regeneration stuff, the muscle recovery stuff, if you're going to recover faster, if you're going to reduce delayed muscle soreness, that could, help with improving your overall training quality. And if there were evidence that, using the red light could improve either your mitochondrial content or perhaps your energy generation capacity in the mitochondria, if it were able to do that, then yes, I think it could be also a useful adjunct to aerobic training, but I'm not aware of a lot of evidence out there quite yet.
Okay. So last question before I get into everyone's favorite, which is supplements. In terms of your diet, like how do you structure your diet, particularly carbohydrates, in terms of improving your overall cardio performance?
I think that for most people, I think for everyone at least, carbohydrates should pretty much be just dialed up to match kind of the level of activity, the performance goal. I like to say, use the phrase like fuel for the work required. So if you have a day where or maybe tomorrow, you're going to be doing a really high intensity session, a long duration session, you have a marathon coming up, you're going to want to, maybe eat more carbohydrates today to perform better tomorrow, and then refuel with more carbohydrates because you expended a lot, you depleted a lot of muscle glycogen. And then if you have a day that's going to be easy, or you're not doing a ton of activity, or maybe you're just strength training, maybe you don't need as many carbs. So I like to say, fuel for the work required. In terms of how I structure, my own intake, I don't prescribe, I don't set out and say like plan my day out, just because I find that to be very, very, very tedious. I have been tracking my food though lately and noticing, interesting, I just posted about this yesterday, but I've actually been trying to eat less protein lately and replace it with carbohydrates, because I found that when I look at the end of the day and look at my macronutrient breakdown, it tends to skew very heavily, at least proportionally, towards protein. I just like to eat protein. And when I sit down to eat a meal, protein tends to be the center of it versus carbohydrate. But as an endurance athlete who generally probably needs to eat a little bit more carbs, I've tried to kind of reduce my protein intake by like 50 to 60 grams a day and eat more carbohydrates in place of that. So in terms of a breakdown, maybe 50 to 60% of carbohydrates, percent calories from carbohydrates is kind of what my diet looks like. Or at least
what type of carbohydrates? And do you try to eat them like pre and post workout, or do you not really care about that too much?
I do. And that's a change that I've actually made. So lately I've tried to concentrate my carbohydrate intake around my workouts. So I will fuel. I generally never, unless I'm working out in the afternoon. So I'm a morning workout person. Sometimes I'll do twice a day. So I'll eat, work out in the afternoon too. But in the morning, I'm working out generally early enough that I just don't want to wake up and eat anything beforehand, but I will fuel during. So if it's a run, I'll use carbohydrate gels. If I'm doing a cycle, so I do a lot of indoor cycling as well, I'll just have like granola bars, maybe some nutrition bars versus, I tend to avoid sports nutrition products unless I really need them. I understand that I could probably use them, but I just don't like them. I don't want to be eating a lot of energy gels when I don't really need to, unless I'm racing or something. So I will try to generally have 50 to 100 grams of carbs, like during a workout. Most of my workouts are like 90 minutes to 2 hours, just to have something there rather than go into this complete like energy deficit during the workout. And then at breakfast, so say afterwards, I'll try to eat a more carbohydrate heavy breakfast, and then lunch and dinner, I'll try to do more protein. So concentrate carbs kind of around the workout, really, when my body can use them, when it's more sensitive to replenishing muscle glycogen. And then I will eat carbs, obviously, the rest of the day at lunch and dinner, but maybe allow myself more protein at those meals versus, say, at breakfast. So that's a strategy that I've kind of been using lately.
And is it more like potato, rice, like that kind of thing post-workout? Or is there anything that you have like sort of as like your go-to, or do you think is the best for replenishing, or is been associated with increased performance for you?
Just, I would say, I don't want to say like simple carbohydrates, but generally I pretty much eat the same thing for breakfast every day. So I have 2 pieces of like sprouted grain toast with eggs, avocado on there. And then I will have like a yogurt bowl with granola. So I do love granola. That's like oats, it has some sugar in there, but again, carbohydrates that you kind of want. So I like whole grains, and then potatoes for dinner, rices and stuff like that for lunch. But yeah, for breakfast,
carbs overall.
It really is. I'm not eating any sort of, really refined carbohydrate. We don't do pasta a lot. So it's either rice, potatoes, and then like whole grain breads and stuff for lunch or for breakfast. And then the granola. I will have some bars that maybe are like a rice bar with carbohydrates, but even then it's not, generally a whole foods diet. I don't really eat a lot of processed food.
Yeah, I'm more or less like rice, sourdough bread, and fruits and a little bit of vegetables overall.
Yeah, fruit too. I didn't mention fruit. Honestly, one of the things I've tried to do also is before I eat breakfast, like the first thing I'll eat after a workout is just fruit. So I'll say whatever fruit I want to have. Maybe it's a banana, some blueberries. I'll try to eat that first and then kind of get into my protein at breakfast. So fruit is a great source of carbs because that's going to be quick, get into your system, start to replenish those glycogen stores. So fruit is great.
All right. I know that we're already kind of getting over time here, and I do have a couple more questions. Just let me know though if you do have to go urgently. I understand. But in terms of supplements, and I'll kind of keep this brief to the ones that I think may have some evidence. Creatine, potentially beta alanine, beetroot, mitochondrial enhancer such as urolithin A, and then also potentially exogenous ketones. So I was just wondering if you could maybe comment on supplements in general, if there's anything that I left out, and if you think that the ones I mentioned are the ones that may have some legitimate efficacy to them.
Yeah. I think everything you mentioned, it has either a positive or a negative answer to it. I think some can be quicker than others. So for creatine, I will say, and let's just focus maybe on, we're talking about aerobic fitness. So in terms of maybe their ability to improve your cardiovascular fitness, maybe we focus on that as kind of an endpoint here.
For sure. We can leave brain health for another time because I know that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, that would be another hour. So creatine, I would say if your main goal is improving cardiorespiratory fitness, creatine is a no. There was actually only one study on this, but I would say creatine, in that study, it actually decreased VO2 max. And the caveat there is that is because it increased the participant's body weight. They gained body weight, so their relative VO2 max actually went down. So it didn't necessarily make people less fit, but if you normalize VO2 to body weight, it did make them less fit because they increased body weight. So if you're trying to improve your VO2 max, creatine, probably a no. Beta alanine, I would say yes, indirectly, because it's going to allow you to train harder. So it's a pretty good performance enhancer for high intensity sessions, taking beta alanine. So I would say yes for that one. I can't cite any studies off the top of my head, but it's one of the more well studied in terms of its being an ergogenic aid. So if you want to really hit your high intensity sessions harder, beta alanine is going to be great for that. Beetroot, I would say yes, again, probably directly and maybe also indirectly. So beetroot, pretty good evidence that it has some efficiency effects during exercise. It'll improve your economy just because it improves your nitric oxide release. It's going to help your endothelial function. So your blood vessels are just able to distribute oxygen better. So I would say that one's pretty good, but there's actually not a lot of evidence that it improves VO2 max as much as it might just help with your, say, exercise economy there. So some decent evidence there for beetroot. Let's see. The two final ones I think that you mentioned are actually where there's only a couple studies lately, but I'm really interested in this space. And I've actually, written a couple articles on the studies that have come out here. So Urolithin A, like you mentioned, it's a mitochondrial enhancer, and it specifically targets this mitophagy process, which is basically autophagy for mitochondria. So clears out damaged mitochondria, helps rebuild new ones. And there was this recent study. They took well-trained runners. They were doing an altitude training camp, and they supplemented with Urolithin A during the training camp. And the runners who supplemented increased their VO2 max more during that training camp than the ones who didn't. And it was a pretty remarkable improvement too. I mean, so they started with a VO2 max of 60 at the start of this study. So they were really fit. And I think the Urolithin A group improved to 65, I think. So they improved 5 mLs per kg with, they were training, but they were using Urolithin as opposed to the placebo group who they might have improved by 1 or 2 mLs per kg per minute. So like a significant boost to VO2 max using Urolithin A during altitude training camp. I think their performance was similar, but it improved the VO2 max more. So I think as an augment to training, if people are trying to improve their VO2 max, Urolithin A seems to be a huge one there that could definitely be pretty beneficial.
Okay. And then, the last one there was exogenous ketones. And then if you could comment, I said mitochondrial enhancers. I listed Urolithin A first, but I'm not sure if there's some other mitochondrial enhancers like CoQ10 or PPQ, or is it PQQ? I forget which one it is. If those ones have any benefit as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure on either of those. I know that there's a mitochondrial targeted antioxidant called MitoQ. There have been some studies on that showing some benefits for mostly for like endothelial function and for cardiovascular health. I'm not quite sure for VO2 max, but mitoquinol, I think, is like the actual name of the compound. MitoQ is actually the supplement brand. Again, I have no affiliation with them. I feel like you like always got to say that when you mention like a supplement on a podcast. I'm like, they're not paying me to say it. I mean, if they want to pay me, they can, but they're not. So yeah, MitoQ though, there's like dozens of studies on MitoQ as being beneficial. That's not a mitochondria enhancer per se, but it's a mitochondrial targeted antioxidant. So it would maybe reduce like reactive oxygen species produced in the mitochondria. But urolithin A, again, is the only one that I'm aware of that's really been studied for VO2 max improvements. And then you mentioned exogenous ketones. So another space, exogenous ketones that I'm interested in. Personally, I use them as well. I've been using them for several years, and it's interesting. This space is interesting because, there are research studies and there are all types of different types of exogenous ketones. I'm interested in them from a recovery standpoint. And personally, I use Ketone IQ, which is a 1,3-butane-diol. So it's a ketone precursor. When your body metabolizes 1,3-butane-diol, it will then produce BHB, which is the main ketone that circulates in your blood and that your body uses for energy. But I've been using that one for Ketone IQ for several years, and because of the recovery benefits, the perceived recovery benefits, and a lot of those benefits that have been shown in studies now. And I wrote about a recent study. They didn't use Ketone IQ in this study. They used a ketone ester, so a ketone monoester, but supplementing with that, using it after training for several weeks led to greater VO2 max improvements. Again, when paired with training, you can't just like take these and improve your VO2 max. But
that was after training, you said, Brady? They took it?
After training. So you would do the training session and then you would take the ketone.
Interesting.
Yeah. So most of the evidence now for ketones is pointing towards using them after versus before exercise. There have been a lot of studies to use them before, and the performance improvements just really aren't that apparent. It's either neutral in most cases. They just don't really improve performance versus, say, a placebo or carbohydrates. Taking them after appears to be the window when you want to do that now. And that's because they are acting as signaling molecules. So they appear to increase EPO. Some studies have shown they increase EPO. They, will, histone deacetylases. So they're having these epigenetic effects and probably some effects on mitochondria as well that are helping to improve VO2 max. So a lot of these signaling effects going on. And so a recent study just showed that taking post-exercise ketones increased VO2 max when you compared that to just training alone. So I would say another one that, like, if you want to augment sort of your training adaptations, doing post-exercise ketones might actually be something to experiment with. And it's something that I've been using for a while now and will continue to be bullish on now that these studies are coming out on the potential VO2 max improvements.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks for clearing that up, especially the post-exercise thing. That's something that I've never heard anyone else talk about before. So appreciate that. Is there any supplements that we missed that you think are super beneficial for improving cardio, or do you think we hit most of the big ones?
I really do think we hit most of the big ones. I mean, a lot of them, again, are going to be just these indirect benefits. I mean, if something allows you to train harder, then it's probably going to help improve your VO2 max. I mean, caffeine, people don't typically think that of being a supplement because it's something we drink every single day. I saw you had your espresso. I got my cup of coffee right here. I mean, it's almost like a food group at this point, coffee and caffeine versus a supplement, but it is a supplement and it enhances performance. But yeah, I think we touched upon the big ones, but it's really, I think if I had to choose one area that I'm most interested just in talking about when it comes to training is sort of these, again, I refer to them as hacks and they're not really hacks, but I'm really interested in there are plenty of people who are smarter than me in talking about how to train, what's the best protocols for training if you want to run a faster 5K or a marathon, but like the science on, what can I do to get more out of my performance, whether it's a supplement or a sauna, like we talked about. The area is just really interesting because you can dial in training. It's like, well, what else can you do when you reach a certain level? You want to figure out these tricks that you can use or add to your routine that are actually going to help you get the most out of training. And so that's where I think a lot of these supplements that we just talked about come in.
Yeah, definitely. And I won't keep you, too much longer. I'll just kind of ask this as like a general question. Like, have SARMs like Cardiovascular or peptides like MOTC or SS31, have they kind of made their way into the running world or not so much?
I think that they have, but not publicly.
Yeah,
So, I
makes
mean, a
sense.
lot of these are, a lot, if not most of these, are banned by the World Anti-Doping Association. So they have probably made their way into the endurance sports realm, but people aren't really talking about them.
Is that something that you've written about before? Have you done much research on those molecules or just not so much because you can't use them?
I haven't, and it's not just because I can't use them, but I just really haven't delved into it. But as they become more popular, I think that I'll maybe it's an area for me to explore in terms of, what's their potential impact on endurance performance. But yeah, not an area that I've currently gotten into. There's just so much stuff out there, and peptides isn't a world that I've dipped my toe into yet.
Okay.
But coming soon, maybe. Yeah,
Can I ask you just one more question?
of course.
Okay. Is VO2 max the single best predictor of longevity?
I think that maybe the single best predictor of longevity may be a bit of an overstatement. What I think that VO2 max is the most robust vital sign that we have. I think it's probably the strongest vital sign, the most important thing that people should be concerned with. It certainly is. Cardiorespiratory fitness certainly is a good predictor of longevity. Is it the single best one? I'm not sure we could confidently say that, but it's the most important vital sign in my opinion.
Okay, excellent. All right, I promised that was my last question, so I'll have to end it there. Pretty much got through everything that I wanted to go through there today. So thank you so much, Brady, for coming on and for answering all my questions. I really do appreciate that. Is there anything else that you want to share today? Maybe let people know about your Substack or anything else that you got going on.
For sure. I'm so in terms of social media, most active on X. People can find me there at Brady BRADY_H, just my last initial. On Substack is where I do most of my more deeper work, like not just like posting tweets and stuff. So that's Physiologically Speaking. I publish a weekly newsletter on there every Friday, and then I'll generally publish either one or two pieces of additional content during the week. Maybe it's a interview, maybe it's a solo episode, maybe it's just me ranting about something I saw on social media. That tends to be a theme pretty lately. So I'll do that. All that's free. You can choose to be a paid supporter as well. I always appreciate that. And then lastly, if people want to learn more about VO2 Max and the science of it, including a lot of the things that we talked about today, I did write a book or self-publish a book. It's called VO2 Max Essentials. People can find that on Amazon if you just search VO2 Max Essentials ebook. It's not just an ebook, it's a hardcover and paperback now. So VO2 Max Essentials book, people can buy that, relatively inexpensive, but it's a pretty digestible book, but it goes kind of deep into some of these concepts that we talked about today. So I would encourage people to go buy that if they're interested.
Awesome. And you're also on Dr. Rhonda Patrick as well. So if people enjoyed this interview and they want to, hear you speak a little bit more, I'm sure there's some things there that she asked you that, I didn't get to today. So, awesome. All right, brother. Well, thanks so much again for coming on. I really do appreciate it. And everyone, thank you so much for listening. And as always, I will be back with another episode soon.